Pursuing equal opportunity, aspiring to be colorblind. I mean, these used to be the core tenets of the original civil rights movement. But critical race theory seems to have destroyed that with this goal of tearing down the republic and rebuilding it, and with some re-racialization. So how did all of this happen? Eric Felten of Real Clear Investigations is here to discuss. Eric, one of the things that you noted in your piece, too, is that as CRT started working its way throughout these academic institutions across the country, was that there was a real focus on law schools and legal departments and really the framework of laws that has constituted our republic, a neutral, something that's kind of, a neutral that it seems that every side should be able to acknowledge without any kind of partisanship. But yet, what CRT and what people like Kimberly Crenshaw were advocating is that you really can't have this framework of laws because the whole system is corrupt. The laws thus regulating all of this are corrupt, so everything has to kind of be thrown out. Was there a real effort to target, was that really kind of the tip of the spears, going after law schools and going after these legal departments at universities and starting there?
Right. If you think about the civil rights movement, you had protests in the streets, you had marches, but you also had a series of legal cases that were brought, and civil rights were affirmed and brought to the forefront in a lot of legal cases that were seen as the real sort of triumph of the civil rights movement. When the critical race theory crew came along, they wanted to reject the civil rights movement and reject its achievements. And that meant having to also go after the courts and say that the achievements of the civil rights movement in the courts was phony, was a sort of put-up job. And they wanted to reject not only the success that the civil rights movement had had in the courts, but also say that the sort of principle of the courts that it's about individuals with rights, and those rights are, litigated and looked at, but it's still about individuals as opposed to social movements. And so the idea was to go after the courts to deny this notion that the courts were a place where individuals would go to have their rights affirmed.
Wow. And it really was, the civil rights movement seemed to almost be an enemy of critical race theorists, or the crits, as you said.
Yeah, the critical race theorists saw the civil rights movement as exhausted, was the term that they put it. And partly it was, I think, that you had such towering leaders as Dr. Martin Luther King, and you had this sort of follow-on movement that knew they weren't going to be able to compete with Dr. King, and so rejected his teaching and rejected his strategy. And then I think you also had this desire to basically discredit the courts and make the courts as no longer someplace you went to have the redress of your grievances, as a way of looking at the courts as just a white institution that wouldn't do anything for African Americans.
Yeah, and therein lies the difference, because they viewed the civil rights movement as essentially just perpetuating an institution that critical race theorists thought was, you're perpetuating the very thing that's oppressing them, essentially, is what they were arguing. That's just, that seems so bizarre to us now, but I can't imagine this argument being made and mainstreamed the way it is now, like 20 years ago. I mean, it would have been sacrilegious to the civil rights movement.
Right, and but part of what was going on was Kimberly Crenshaw and a number of the other race crits were very upset about the Bakke decision that put limitations on affirmative action. And so part of this movement came about in an effort to stop the courts from limiting affirmative action. And so rejecting the notion that there could be anything that somebody might call reverse racism. and to say there's only one kind of racism, and that's the institutional kind.